Good afternoon. I do hope that you and your family and friends and neighbors are well and that you're finding ways to manage this commonly difficult situation with some grace. I thank you for joining us this afternoon. I also like to thank Skyline Village Chicago for the invitation to speak today, and in particular, Regan Burke, Nancy Thompson, and Phyllis Mitson for all that they did to help make this happen. Before we start, though, I do feel the need to contextualize this moment that we're in for anyone who might be watching at a later date. Today is May 29th, 2020. Over 2 months ago, on March 20th, Illinois Governor Pritzker issued a stay-at-home order for the state of Illinois as a precaution against the spread of the coronavirus, which as of today, has claimed almost 100,000 American lives. That's why I am delivering this talk to you from my study at my home into your homes. Additionally, we are facing the worst economic downturn and unemployment rate since the Great Depression. Then, just 4 days ago, a Black Minneapolis resident named George Floyd died when 4 Minneapolis police officers pinned him to the ground, one of whom kept a knee pressed to Mr. Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes, which caused his death. The incident was recorded by a passerby, and then the nation, and then the world was witness. Today is the 4th day of large-scale protests in Minneapolis and many other cities across the country. When Regan contacted me about doing this talk, we obviously had no idea our world would change and change so dramatically. I had assumed that I'd be giving a version of the talk I had been giving since last August when my book first came out. What I thought I'd be talking about is what I always talked about, is how Chicago went from being a city with just a handful of homegrown theater endeavors of their own to an internationally recognized theater town with some 250 homegrown theater companies. What you're looking at there is a list that the League of Chicago Theaters gave me. I know you can't read it from where you are, but it'll give you a sense of how many companies there are. And this is a short and hurried list of artists whose careers were spawned and or nurtured here. Normally, I'd talk about how such a thing could happen over the course of my own lifetime, which, from my humble perspective, has been relatively brief so far. I mean, 250 theater companies. How did this happen? How did this happen? That was the question at the center of my working on the book Ensemble. To take just one example out of many, how did we get from this to this to this? But as I talk to you today, the theaters I used to talk about are closed. The seats are empty. The world has changed, and we are changing too. And so will the life of Chicago theater. There can be no doubt about that. Someday we'll wake from our quarantine and find, like Rip Van Winkle, that we have walked into a new era. And I have been wondering what the Chicago theater scene I had been describing will look like when this is over. Will all 250 theater companies survive? How will they adapt, and how will this change them? When will those of you who are saints, I know some of you are saints, when will you hand out your first playbill? I do find myself wondering if what I had been talking about is now a bygone era, that we are living in the pause before the start of a new era. I wonder too, if that's necessarily a bad thing. There are just so many questions. Of course, no one can tell us the answers to these questions with any real certainty or authority. We can speculate, and we do. We can pretend clairvoyance, and we do. But we cannot know. This afternoon, I'd like to share with you some audio clips from the interviews I did for Ensemble to sift through for any clues of what might help the Chicago theater scene to rebuild after this crisis and return perhaps even better than before. And in the meantime, help its theatermakers persevere through the anxiety of this uncertainty. Last week, about 55 days into the quarantine, I talked with Chicago Shakespeare Theater founder and artistic director Barbara Gaines. She's quoting Winston Churchill here, whom she said she likes to read, particularly at times like this.
I love this quote. It's perfect for this moment. And when you ask what my vision is, this is my vision. So Winston says, "It is a mistake to try and look too far ahead. The chain of destiny can only be grasped one link at a time." That chain, I am grabbing on that link that I can see. I cannot see the next chain. But we're a flexible organization, and that kind of flexibility is going to help us.
Just 4 years ago, in 2016, Harmony France and Danny Smith founded Firebrand Theater, a company dedicated to musical theater works and with the mission of empowering women. They opened in an 80-seat space on the first floor of the Den with a dazzling production of Lizzie. It was an immediate critical success, as were subsequent productions. Firebrand embodies what I think of as elements of the Chicago theater spirit. It's about creating your own opportunity. It's about spontaneity, full-out commitment. It's about intimacy, unadorned authenticity, risk-taking, and an activist orientation. Now in their 4th year, Harmony cannot say with any certainty what will happen to their young company, but she does seem confident of one thing.
It's going to survive anywhere with Chicago.
Why do you say that?
Because like you said, we create it out of nothing. We create it. No one has a storefront community like we do. We create off no money. We stay up all night. We sleep at the theater. We paint our own sets when we have to. We're so scrappy. We're so activist based. We're so progressive. We work. We work here. We work at our art. If it's going to survive anywhere, it's going to be here. And it might not be me. It might be this new generation. But it's going to survive.
Well, it's in the DNA.
It's in our, yeah.
Yeah.
We're working class artists. It's so about the work, and it's so about, especially with the newer storefront companies, we all had activist missions, and I don't think that's going to change.
So what did I mean when I said to Harmony, it's in the DNA? Well, that's exactly what I had set out to explore and tried to capture in Ensemble. And I wanted to tell it almost exclusively in the first person by patching together almost 300 interviews as if the speakers were sitting at the same table, sharing memories. This is a page from the book to give you an idea of what it looks like. It's not monologues. It's not one single narrative. It's more like a dialogue. While conducting these interviews, I came to understand that there are unique dispositions, let's call them, as a nod to my academic past, dispositions that have served this community well in the past and propelled it forward. I'd like to share with you now just a few examples of genetically inherited dispositions that I think will help Chicago theater fight their way back when the time comes. The first of them is a disposition that says, if there's no opportunity available, I will make my own. Near the end of last year, Bob Fall's predecessor at the Goodman, director Gregory Mosher, asked me to speak to the faculty and students of the theater department at Hunter College in New York. He wanted me to give a talk on the subject, why wait to get hired when you could start your own damn company? In fact, he wrote that title for me. His aim was to impart to these New York students and faculty the Chicago ethos that he knew well as one of its pioneers. Don't wait to be chosen for someone else's enterprise. Make your own. It's a spirit that runs deep. In 1940, for example, The playwright Langston Hughes formed an early theater company in Chicago called Skyline Players on the South Side. When that disbanded, the Center Aisle Players opened with performances at the YMCA on 38th and Wabash. And that was followed by others that I'll mention in just a moment. The story I told in Ensemble, though, begins 13 years later in 1953, because that's the year I believe that disparate efforts, inspired by what had preceded them, began to get traction as an actual movement.
I'd like to give you an idea of how we were viewed, especially by New Yorkers in the year 1953. This is journalist A.J. Liebling, who was writing for the New Yorker magazine. He came to Chicago and did a series of articles about us, and this is a taste of it.
It's not considered smart to admit having seen any play in Chicago, because this implies either A, that you haven't seen the real play, or B, that you haven't the airplane fare to New York. He later collected the pieces into a book he called The Second City. That same year, however, Paul Sills and David Shepard, undaunted by the fact that the University of Chicago, which Paul attended, had no theater department, created their own damn company at the university, which they called Playwrights Theater Club. It would launch the careers of Barbara Harris, Mike Nichols and Elaine May, Joyce and Byrne Piven, and Ed Asner, among others. It would also unknowingly launch what we now think of as the Chicago theater movement. They first performed on the third floor of Mandel Hall at the University of Chicago and later moved to the second floor of what had been a Chinese restaurant, making it one of Chicago's earliest storefront theaters. Playwrights Theater Club lasted barely 2 years, but they produced an ambitious schedule of some 22 productions of classic works. When it disbanded, some of the players regrouped as the nation's first improvisational theater called the Compass Players. And then when that disbanded, less than 2 years later, Paul Sills, Bertie Solins, and Howard Alk opened a small cabaret that they named, with gratitude to A.J. Liebling, The Second City. It was 1959. In the 1960s, on the North Side, Bob Sickinger arrived in Chicago to direct the Hull House Theater, which drew on local talents at a time when most conventional theater offerings were either summer stock or touring productions of Broadway shows. At the same time, on the south side of Chicago, black theater was expanding too, and it grew to include some 10 black theater companies in the 1970s. These companies, like Playwrights Theater Club did, opened as a way to create opportunity where there had been none, but for a different reason.
Keep in mind that most of the black theaters that were created between the 1950s and, say, 1967 were created because we were not allowed to participate. Okoro Harold Johnson, I think, was the first black director who was allowed to direct a play at Theater on the Lake. He was the very first one. You had all these actors who weren't able to find work. They were restricted by being in these environments. So they created theater companies so that they would have a way to express themselves. By the time I came along, it wasn't as important. We started creating for the purpose of serving our communities. It wasn't about being excluded. It was about creating art that would uplift the lives of our folks.
Then, in 1974, Gary Sinise, Terry Kinney, and Jeff Perry co-founded Steppenwolf Theater in a space they crammed into a church basement in Highland Park. Listen to what Gary says was a driving force for them.
You used the phrase, get a theater started. What was your concept then? Were you thinking in terms of an ensemble, or were you thinking just of putting on plays? What was the notion then?
Well, I think we were thinking of an alternative to what you would normally consider doing once you left college as an actor. What are your options? Well, people go to Hollywood or people go to New York, and at that time in the mid-'70s, there weren't a lot of theaters in Chicago, not a lot going on. And, I think we were just looking for an alternative to going to New York or or Los Angeles or something like that. We were looking to create a company of actors that had control over our own work. And we were all willing to sacrifice trying to make a living doing that work for controlling our own work. So that, we would get jobs, and everybody had different day jobs, and we could pick our own plays, we could pick our own parts, we could determine who was directing and who was acting, and we were kind of had our creative control, which is what everybody was more interested in than going off and auditioning for a lot of things and all of that. We were willing to kind of just do our plays and work our day jobs.
That sounds like a real motivating factor then, this idea of having control over your own options and your own work.
Yeah, and, maybe for some people it was just fear of the unknown, Well, at least I know I can go up and live in a basement and do some plays, and rather than just going off to the big city of Hollywood and New York and trying to, make it on my own. I'll go up to Highland Park and work in a basement, and at least I'll get to pick my own parts.
Last week I spoke with Paimon and theater artist and cultural leader Massequa Myers about Chicago after the quarantine. And I was really struck by the resonance between what they had to say and what Gary Sinise had said.
Yeah. Artists fall into a number of different categories. You have those artists that wait for someone to give them an opportunity. Then you have the artists that create opportunities. And then you have those artists that have been forced into a position to become administrators or landlords, even though sometimes they had no intention of doing that. The people that will survive this, I think, will be the people that are not waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They're going to be those artists that create in a new way.
Is it possible that this impulse, this disposition toward creating one's own opportunities, is so firmly ingrained in the DNA of the theater community here that they'll be able to draw on it when they return? In the last decade alone, we continue to see new companies forming. In addition to Firebrand, there was Manual Cinema, Artemisia, Definition Theater, Broken Nose, Windy City Playhouse, Ghostlight Ensemble, and others, all of them carving out brave new niches for themselves.
Well, I've always been, perhaps like you, a bit romantic about Chicago theater. So many of us were born out of absolutely ridiculous circumstances, with no money, very little support. At the time I started at Wisdom Bridge, Mayor Daley was adamantly opposed to small theater companies, which he found threatening. But yet, bit by bit, we grew, and that happened in the early 70s and the mid 70s, and certainly after that, many, many more, hundreds of theaters grew from virtually nothing.
In 1960, the great actor Alan Arkin's career was going nowhere when Paul Seals invited him to come to Chicago and join the company of the newly opened Second City. I asked Alan about his days in Chicago, and this was his response, a half a century later.
One of the things I think about periodically, I think a lot of me maybe it would have been smarter had I stayed in Chicago. Because exactly what you're talking about, there was a sense of us against the world, a sense of a family that was really genuine when I was at Second City, and I've looked for that my entire career and found it maybe 6 or 8 times. But not nearly as much as I could have had I stayed there.
Back when I could sit in a movie and then watch it like 2 and 3 times because they wouldn't kick you out, Russians Are Coming is one of those that I just kept watching. There's something.
Yeah, well, that the Russians Are Coming was an extension of Second City in a way, because Norman Jewison had a brilliant and very embracing philosophy of film. That everybody, it was a community project. We were all doing it for the same reason. It had enormously important social significance for us, all of us. And so that had that had very much that sense of community that you're talking about that comes out of Chicago. And about a half a dozen movies over the years have had that sense of, but not terribly much more than that.
Laurie Metcalf, an original member of Steppenwolf Theater, spoke to me about what she felt made the company so successful.
Were you using the term ensemble early on?
I think we did. I think very early on we just called ourselves Steppenwolf Theater Ensemble, maybe. I think we used it. If we didn't use it formally, it was always in our heads that what we did was as a group. Nobody thought, I'm going to use this as a platform for myself,
Really?
Mm-mm.
It was really all about the group then.
It was about the work. It was about how are we going to make this the best thing possible. It was collaborative from the beginning. We wanted to make an impression not individually but as a group, and so maybe we knew we had energy, we had passion, we had a shared sense of humor. And we wanted to, we wanted the group to succeed.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted the group to succeed. That sentence hit me when I first heard it, and every time I've played it since then. But now more than ever, I think. Think of the significance of that thought. At this moment, a global pandemic, a fierce and unseemly election on the horizon, George Floyd, the city of Minneapolis, and so many other cities across the country. Right now, we wanted the group to succeed. The reason I called my book Ensemble is because of the disposition which says we wanted the group to succeed expands well beyond individual ensemble companies to a desire for the entire theater scene here to succeed. It's the firm belief that rising tides raise all boats. Derek Sanders, who co-founded Congo Square Theater in 1999, told me this story. And as you listen to it, I want you to know that I heard countless different variations on this exact same theme.
Let me tell you a story. Can I tell you a real quick story about that?
Yes, you
do. So we were doing Joe Turner's Come and Gone, right? That we did it with the Goodman in co-production with the Goodman. At the time we are in rehearsal, my executive director comes to me and says, "We run out of money." Before we even hit tech, like this is maybe a week or so before we hit tech, right? And he said, "I don't know how we're going to finish the set. I don't know how we're going to get this up." Then out of the blue, Amy Morton calls me and says, "Hey, Derek, can you come down to Steppenwolf? I'm in rehearsal, but I would love for you to, I need to talk to you." And I love Amy. I love Amy Morton, right? And if Amy calls me, I'm going to come, And I said, "Sure, Amy, I'll come down there and meet you." Sure. So I go down there. Amy comes down and say, "Hey, Derek, I was a part of a theater company called Remains. Remains. And we had always talked about, getting back together, and we just never did, but we kept our account open." And he was like, and we're looking around at the Chicago landscape and companies we felt like symbolized the work that we did. And she handed me a check and said, "We want you to have a piece of Remains." Right? I almost cried. I almost cried. That sent us over the top. I think it was like $10,000 or something like that, and that was just enough to get us through tech and to get us through one of our more amazing productions of our company's history. Right? That to me symbolizes what Chicago community is really about.
Yeah.
To me, it's one of those things where a company like Remains can reach back to a company of color that they didn't know, they didn't even know they would know, you know? And she didn't know we needed it desperately. She didn't know any of that. And it was just one of those things that I'm deeply proud of. You know, it's just one of those moments that I go, that's why I'm at Chicago. That's why I did Chicago theater, you know, because of stuff like this.
This is part of the character of the place, I think. And I do think it will serve them well when it's time to return. This is Tony Award-winning director David Cromer, who got his start in Chicago. After being a student at Columbia College, he went on to direct and act in storefronts around the city. He has since directed around the country, off-Broadway, and on Broadway, and he is now a New Yorker. I think he offers an interesting perspective given his insider status in both cities. I want you to hear this.
There's always a lot of New York versus Chicago posturing in Chicago because there's really only one model for a theater city. Or there's a couple. I guess there's London and in the English-speaking world, London and New York. I was on a panel once, and it turned into the way these panels often do, which is defensiveness about Chicago versus New York and a little bit of New York bashing. And Gary Griffin piped up and said something really wonderful that I quote all the time. He said, you know, I don't want this to turn into a bunch of New York bashing because New York's great. I love New York. New York's sexy and it's exciting. The difference is Chicago does not have a for-profit. We don't have a for-profit model. We have some, but not much. It's mostly a not-for-profit model. Once it's a not-for-profit model, failure is okay, risk is okay. It's okay to share. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You're not playing King of the Hill. There's not only one spot. Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of spots. So automatically the values of like, well, let's try this, see what it is. And New York is a for-profit model, and there's an enormous amount of money at stake, and space is limited in every conceivable sense. That articulated to me what I'd always felt and never thought about. Which was, you know, you could try and fail. You were not going to be destroyed by failing, which just meant there was more later, that if you're willing to think that it all doesn't have to be right now, that there was more later, you could keep trying.
Bernie Sahlins put it this way in his memoir. Chicago is the risk capital of the world, a blessed city where you have the right to fail. Now, no one wants to fail, but knowing that failure is not the end of the world or even the end of your career, I think allows for much experimentation and all that can come of the experimentation. When I met with actor and director Amy Morton, we sat at her dining room table, and I remember her saying something that really struck me, and I flagged it as the epigraph for my book right at that moment. And this is what she said. In Chicago, we weren't going to get rich and we weren't going to get famous, so we just got good. This is home. One of the best examples of that is Michael Shannon, who started his career in Chicago. This was the marquee when he appeared with Audra McDonald in Frankie and Johnny on Broadway recently. And this was the marquee at his home theater, a Red Orchid Theater, which he helped found. It seats about 80. Michael toggles beautifully between the two, giving both an equal dose of his time and his commitment. When a Red Orchid revived a production of Victims of Duty, which they had originally done in 1995, few people even knew who Michael Shannon or Guy Van Swearingen or director Shira Piven were. They struggled to fill the 80 seats. When they revived it in 2018, with Guy and Michael in the cast and Shira directing again, The tickets sold out the same day. I spoke with Michael, Guy, and Shira before one of their rehearsals in a small office on the second floor of the theater. On the wall was this photo of Michael and Guy a long time ago.
You know, a lot of times I think that I don't even know who that is.
Oh, really?
And yet I know that it's probably, you know, we have a lot in common, I guess. But my life was so different back then. There's so much that, I mean, everybody, you know, 20 years goes by, everybody has a lot of stuff happen, but I mean, I had a lot of stuff happen.
Yeah.
Like, but I think I'm a intrinsically very nostalgic person. I'm kind of riddled with it, nostalgia. I think I find it comforting somehow. I guess without it, life just seems too chaotic, too random. Because I mean, the thing of it is that I was not a person that was on the fast track to success. Really, I mean, I was like a barely functional person, and I found this devotion that is in and of itself, as we were saying earlier, somewhat elusive and bizarre, but I was devoted to it no matter what. And then all this other crazy stuff happened. But yeah, in a strange way, I feel safe here somehow.
Here?
Yeah. This is like my den, you know. Helps me remember who I am. You know?
Yeah.
This is Michael sitting in the Old Town Ale House, about a block from a Red Orchid Theater. He's watching the Academy Awards. This was the night when The Shape of Water, a film in which he co-starred, was up for several Oscars. Michael had directed Brett Neview's play Traitor at Red Orchid around that time, and this was closing night. Mike chose to be here. Tribune theater critic Chris Jones saw the photo and made this observation about it. I don't recall ever seeing a picture that so vividly expresses acting in Chicago and refusing to let Hollywood change you. All of this is not to say there isn't friction in this community. There is, and a lot of it. But without friction, nothing can move. Questions of gender, racial, and ability equity on Chicago stages, as well as parity of resource allocation and who gets the attention they need and deserve, are persistently and vociferously discussed, debated, and argued. It gets messy, fractious, and divisive. But I have sensed an underlying and abiding belief that this is the work and commitment of a community constantly struggling to improve rather than to tear itself apart. These are necessary battles. I'd like to end with an uninterrupted 10 minutes of clips from my interviews with theater leaders last week. We talked about how they are handling the pandemic and its quarantine, and speculation about what might happen next.
We didn't know what was going on for quite a while. We were optimistic, and then finally realized that we were not going to be putting this production on in the late spring. So we let it go and fully postponed it until next spring. So a year postponement on that. But I think that sent me into a place of sort of reset and reflection and realizing that I personally could not just throw myself into the work as if I'm going to solve everything. I'm going to ride in on the horses. I'm going to join people riding in with flags. We're all going to make this work. No, I think there's too much to absorb, both culturally and personally. And for a minute, I really want to talk about personally, just a sense of sitting and reflecting and experiencing grief, loss, change, and sitting with the unknown and having to recognize that no matter what it is I may want, I have no control over it whatsoever. And just that was good. That was a good thing. That took about a week or two, maybe even 3 weeks.
I saw that morning, the morning of March 12th, I woke up early, and it was like it was an electrical bolt that said, you have to close the theater today. I called one of our staff and I said, we have to close today. And well, let's just wait. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. So I said, okay, but I feel like this has to happen. And then quite frankly, Charlie Newell called me on the way to work and he said, are you closing? And I said, well, either today or tomorrow. I said, but as soon as possible. And then it was mid-afternoon by that point, and that I got to the theater, and I saw the look in the eyes of the staff. I saw I saw the pain behind people's eyes. And I said, I called Chris Henderson in New York, where he had just found out that they were not going to open. And I said, we have to close, and we have to close immediately. And so that's basically what happened. I think Chris and I both realized that it wasn't a theater issue anymore. It was a public health issue. And there is absolutely no question that we did the right thing. No.
We got shut down. Our 2019-20 season, we did our first production, and it went well. Hope, part 2 of a Mexican trilogy. And that was in September, October. 2 days into rehearsal for our second show, The Dream King, which is a world premiere by one of our ensemble members, Marvin Quijada, directed by Sandra Marquez, we had to shut things down. And that's pretty much it. That was our season. One production and 2 days of rehearsal. So like everyone else, we're recouping and seeing what we can do to keep our ensemble members active, to see what we could do to financially help those in need.
Worries me the most, Mark, is returning to a normal, returning to what we used to do. I really hope that after living through this pandemic, that we address the seriousness of inadequacies as it relates to our society, and that there's some serious discussion and action and implementation of new ideas to level the playing field or make the playing fields more equal. And that worries me the most, that people keep saying that let's get back to normal, but I don't think we want to get back to normal. I think we want to get back to a new normal that addresses some serious concerns about how we live and treat each other.
We want to get to a better
new.
We cannot go backwards. We have to incorporate these lessons that each of us individually and as a group are learning. Sean O'Casey. If one loves life, one welcomes change, because love always seeks different ways of giving of itself. So what will happen, I'm not going to think very much about, because I have no control over it. I will not obsess about it. The only behavior I can change is my own in this world. So it wasn't too long ago, maybe a few weeks ago, maybe less, that I just had to say to myself, becoming overwhelmed, becoming obsessed with sadness, with worry, with grief, does me no good, and does the theater no good, and actually does my dog no good, because she feels my emotions.
Yeah.
So I just snapped out of it. I snapped out of it when I realized that I just said this to someone last night. This is the room that we're in. Let's learn how to live in it better. Let's learn how to make the theater better from this moment on.
I think anytime a theater says openly, we don't know what's happening, they get points. I think anytime someone says, we're going to do our whole season as audio plays, or we're going to film them and you can watch them and call them theater or whatever the fuck you want, we're still going to fulfill our promise in a different way instead of making you wait, I think that's great too. I think any realistic discussion about what's happening instead of all these emails like, we'll be back. It's like, maybe you won't. Maybe that's not so bad. Maybe it's not safe for you to come back. Any kind of reality, any kind of public questioning or asking what an audience wants, I think that really inspires me, that it's like, oh, this theater wants to stick around. They don't want to just compete or thrive during this. They're really taking the time to say, the story is not about us right now. The story is about y'all. It's about y'all being safe, because since this virus hits like so many different sects of society, I can't imagine the kind of hubris where it's like, oh, if 60% of our subscribers are over the age of 70 and the death rate markets those people, why are we being so cavalier about trying to get the ball rolling? And I think if we open these doors without following every rule, that's the path to somebody getting an infection they should not have.
You know, my tulips this year, it's the banner year for tulips. Oh my God, the beauty of our backyard with these tulips that offer vibrancy and color and nourishment. It's been a banner year. They've never lasted this long. And the resiliency of those creations is something that is, I mean, actors have to be resilient to dare to make a life in the theater. So the resiliency that my tulips have, you know, and nature has, because they don't care about us. They're going to do what they need to do to survive. That same resiliency and the closely knitted community that we have galvanizes the resiliency and makes it even stronger. And that's something that provides hope.
I think we have, we already were making the weirdest, best new plays, and the audience that we have is sensational. They know what they like and they're excited about it. So I think that the level of thirst is there. I don't think that's gone away at all. We don't necessarily need tourists to make this whole system work. There are people within our city limits that are really excited about the work that's going on here. I also think since we have a lot of storefront spaces, we have a lot of people who are who have strong ingenuity with making spaces work when they shouldn't. I know a lot of back in the days when I was starting, there's a group of people where if we go into space for a wedding or space for a bar, we're like, how many seats can we fit here? Da, 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 da. Now with social distancing, I do that too when I'm walking around. I'm like, you could go here and here and here and here. I share that with all these people who create stuff on a small and medium level here. So we're good at it. I think that will lend itself to thinking really smart about health and how we fit an audience in a place that maybe what didn't used to be a theater. We are big fans of making space out of things that weren't theater spaces. So that's what excites me. And what scares me is we have hundreds of people dying a week here, and we have the third or second most cases in the entire country. Like something, yeah. It's a scary time. I feel weird thinking optimistically, openly, but I know that we have such a strong will. And we see theater as an essential service that just needs to be on pause right now so we can figure it out better.
I have a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues in New York City where I think this has struck them much harder. Not to take away from anybody who has suffered. And I think there's been a lot of suffering. And as we said, there will continue to be suffering just simply around employment, if nothing else. But, you know, the New Yorkers I've talked to there's a sense of devastation that they're experiencing. And again, I think the culture of New York City artistically is different I mean, we've talked about that, just the way theater was created from its ensemble nature as opposed to New York. And my heart goes out to them, and it's very painful to hear and watch and look at. And maybe it is a Midwestern optimism. Maybe it is coming from Chicago, where we've seen the theater community grow from virtually nothing in a short time, very short time, that I have found my colleagues a bit more optimistic and a bit more approaching all of this with a sense of hope, which I think is the way one sort of has to. And we will meet maybe harder truths as they come with the resourcefulness and the resilience that we have as artists and as a community.
Is there a way you feel like the community over romanticizes itself?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the reverential sense of community, the reverential sense of we may not have the money, but boy, we got love, you know.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's how you keep a community together too. You know, it's like any community's self-definition. Some of it's true and some of it isn't. But enough of it is true so that it has meaning.
Yeah.
And I think it still has meaning.
This is playwright Idris Goodwin. He said something that had a real impact on me. It was in an American Theater magazine article, and he was talking about the quarantine. He said this: "This ain't the intermission, it's the show. This is the moment where everything changes. We are in the inciting incident. We are in the inciting incident." I believe he's right. I now think of my own work in this way. My book Ensemble, and those by Richard Christensen, Jeff Sweet, Chris Jones, Harvey Young, John Mayer, Pete Blatchford,
is the exposition.
What I think we're experiencing now, as Goodwin suggested, is the inciting incident for what will follow. It is the beginning of the story of how Chicago theater returned from a devastating crisis and what it became, not in spite of, but because of it. If the story of how the Chicago theater movement began and grew into a vital, internationally recognized theater town is any indication, there is every reason to hope that it will return, not to what it once was, but, as Paimon and Maseko said, to a new and better normal. I do wish you all health and safety and a better, more just tomorrow for all. Thank you.